All right, cool. So this is the auto layout redesign. If you joined us for Config 2022, this was unveiled and highlighted and demonstrated. And the one thing that I want to emphasize about this new redesign with auto layout, it's a progressive enhancement. So much of the new features don't break old things that you did. It just is an addition to auto layout. So when we go through some of these new features, a lot of it is going to be new ways of interacting with old ways of doing things. So you're not actually learning a new auto layout. You're just learning some new ways and hopefully some easier and demystified ways of kind of interacting and using auto layout in your designs. Once again, you are joined by myself, Miggy, and Tom Lowry. Tom, say hi.
Hey all.
And we're going to be giving you this walkthrough. And without further ado, let's go. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about, I'm going to walk you through some of the new on-canvas enhancements that we have with auto layout. So I'm going to cover a couple of quick basics as well as spacing and padding. I'm going to give you all of those shortcuts for productivity that y'all love. So the first thing here I want to highlight is that whenever you're working with auto layout, the easiest way to create one is to use Shift A. So if I click a text box and I have this text box here, when I press Shift A, what it's going to do is wrap that around an auto layout frame. So now that it's in this auto layout frame, I can give it dimension. So I can give it some padding. I can give it a fill. So this is ideal for buttons. So this is probably one of the most common use cases that you'll encounter. So if you are just using a text field, it'll create a frame around it. So if you already have a frame, so this right here, if I look over here on the left, this is actually named affectionately frame 16,051. This is a lived-in file. You can see that this text object within this frame, when I press Shift A, it's going to convert that frame to auto layout. Now, if you're working on auto layout, and what that means is by default, it's going to hug this contents. So as you type in, it'll expand. If you need to break that apart, right? So I know a lot of people out there, they're like, okay, cool, I made my auto layout, but for whatever reason you want to disassemble it. To remove auto layout, you're going to hit Option or the Alt key on Windows, Shift A. So when I do that, it's going to break it down to a regular frame. And if I want to break that frame, I can hit Command Shift G. So that'll remove the frame entirely. So once again, right now this is an auto layout, right? So this frame is here. You can see I can adjust the padding here. If I hit Shift Option A, it converts it to a regular frame, then Command Shift G, and that breaks it down. So I particularly enjoy these shortcuts when I'm like working, when I'm creating a lot, and I oftentimes see that, people aren't aware of them, so I just wanted to highlight them right here. So a couple other quick things too with auto layout. Whenever you have like a bunch of items, so each of these are separate buttons, you can nest auto layout inside of auto layout. So if I select them here, I just saw a quick a question from Kate. Can we add the Windows shortcuts also? Basically, anytime you see Option, it's just going to be Alt. Anytime you see Command, it's going to be Control. All right, so when I select these items right here, when I press Shift A, and if I select these and I press Shift A, Figma's going to try to do the best that it can to assume how you're going to construct those elements. So you see here that this auto layout, because those elements are constructed left or right, these are top down. When I press Shift A, it's going to construct them vertically or horizontally. And at any given point, you can always change that vertical or horizontal direction. So this is just review. These are some basic things that I just don't want you all to forget about. Also, I can select this and move this left and right using the right and left arrow keys. Same thing here. I can select inside here and move up and down. It's one of the big benefits of auto layout. So, oops, I just lost my, I moved that up out of the way. There we go. So here we go. So next up, what we're going to be talking about, this screen is lifted directly from the auto layout playground. So if you go to Figma community, figma.com/@Figma, you can see the auto layout playground. So a lot of these examples that we have here today are lifted from there. So I just want to highlight this so then this way you can see where this is located. With the new auto layout, there's actually a bunch of new UI that have been added that help you better understand the way that the layout is being constructed. So when you select the internal padding, you will see an icon and a number there representing that you can edit to then kind of change those values. So when you're adjusting vertical spacing or horizontal spacing, those icons will be represented accordingly. Same way with padding. So when the padding is moving around the object, you will see that little icon up above that highlights those values. You can select each of these individually. So left padding, right padding, you can do left and right padding, top and bottom padding, but then also when you select them all at the same time, you can adjust them as comma separated values. So let's walk into that just really quickly. So here, when you see that visualized on kind of like an object like this card here, you will see spacing kind of exist between the elements and you'll see padding along the outside. So if I select this object here, I can double click it and then I can see that value. And you see when I hover it, it says top padding. So I can increase that value. I can decrease that value. If I want to select other values, I can just go ahead and go there and select it. I can also double click inside to this nested auto layout element. And you'll see here when I hover over, I see that value of 10. When I click, I can then change that value. So I can either scrub it right here, or I could type in the value specifically right there. So one thing that I do want to highlight, so this right here is an auto layout frame. If I then convert this to a component, so this is now a component, I can still see those values. However, if I have an instance, right? This instance, I won't see the on canvas values. Those values can still be adjusted in the design panel. So right here, I can still adjust that padding on the instance. However, I won't be able to do it there. So that's just one consideration we want to highlight. That is done. So then this way, there's no accidental input on the instance itself. So one little highlight that we wanted to be there. So if you have an auto layout component instance and you're wondering why the on canvas controls aren't showing up, that's going to be why. So let's talk a little bit more about spacing between items as well. So here you can see that between any item that you have, you can control that spacing. And now we have the addition of negative spacing. So let's walk you through that. So each of these elements here, they're in an auto layout object, right? So if I click in between, right, and I highlight this, you can see the spacing values there. So I can drag those values, and before you wouldn't be able to apply negative values, but guess what? You can apply negative values now. So as I drag this left, I can actually see that negative value. So right now it's 19, I could say negative 19, and that is now stacked vertically negatively. Cool. So one little highlight or shortcut that I want to demonstrate right here, hold shift when dragging to adjust by the nudge value. So what that means is if I hit command / to bring up the quick menu, if you don't know where the quick actions menu is, you can click on the Figma icon in the top left, click quick actions, and you'll see it right here. I'm going to type in nudge amount. So the nudge amount is the amount that you can move items using the keyboard commands. So small nudge is 1, the big nudge, when you hold down the shift key and press it, it'll go by a larger number. That number can be customized. So I normally have mine set to a value of 8. So what that means is that here, when I go to adjust my spacing, right? So, oops, wrong one. So here, when I go to adjust my spacing, if I hold down the shift key, you'll notice that my value actually is increasing and decreasing by my big nudge. So there we go. It's 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48. So great way to learn your multiples. Okay, so next, let's talk about padding. So when we look at padding, we're talking about all of the kind of like outside spacing off all of those elements. So if you're familiar with CSS, HTML, right, padding is not going to be new to you. So here I can go ahead and I can select my padding and I can adjust it individually, right? So here I'm going ahead and I'm adjusting that padding individually. However, I can also go ahead and hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows. And what that's going to do is select the padding on opposing sides. So let's say I want to go to adjust these values is here on the left and right. I'm holding down the Alt key or Option key. I'm sorry, the Option key or Alt key on Windows. So here we go. I hold down that value. And now if you want to adjust them from all sides, you can hold down the Option and Shift key and it'll scale all together. So one thing I want to identify right here are constraints. So because this auto layout object is inside of this frame, I can actually apply constraints to it. So right now I have center constraints. If it was instead set to the default of top left, when I go to adjust these, you'll see these adjust from the top left. If I change those constraints back to center, you'll see that when I adjust them, they actually grow and contract from the center. So once again, Option or Alt key, drag canvas, you can drag that value. One other thing, if you click, so if I hold down the Option key and I click here, boom, there goes my value, and it's affecting both of them. If I do the same thing with Option and Shift, you'll get all of the values that you want, so you'll get all paddings. So if I go ahead and type 40, it applied 40 to all of them. If I go ahead and click, I can say 40, comma 10, comma 20, comma 30, and it will apply all of those paddings to those values. Lastly, if you go over here on the right, you can hit Command key and type them in the same way. So I could just type in 80, and then there we go, we got all paddings. I'll show you that for you one more time. Hit the Command key, click in that field, and say 10, comma 20, comma 30, comma 40. Boom, and then it's gonna apply all of those paddings. If I wanna undo that, hit the Command key one more time, hit 40, and then all of those paddings are set. And then the last thing I want to highlight in this section is a fun little bit that Oscar, one of the developers on Auto Layout, put me onto yesterday. And that is you can tab through the values. So when I select on the padding, you'll notice here, this is selected. So when I hit tab, it's going to go top, right, bottom, left, top, right, bottom, left, and then go right into the spacing. So I can adjust the spacing, hit the tab key, adjust the top, hit the tab key, adjust the right, hit the tab key, adjust the bottom, hit the tab key, and then just the left one, hit the tab key. So hitting that space bar, hitting on that padding, and then hitting the tab bar, and then going through all of them. So it's one of my favorites. Now let's talk a little bit about resizing, and I'm going to hand this over to Tom.
All right.
Tom, are you ready?
I think I'm ready. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Cool. So when you're putting elements inside an auto layout frame, you're going to see two key things, three key things. One is the ability to select an element inside it and set something to fill, fixed, or hug. And I think if you've used the previous auto layout before, some of the controls that you use to do this have slightly moved in the properties panel. So let's take a look at a quick example here. If we look at this card, instead of having this diagram down here where you used to be able to control all of the different resizing behaviors, the resizing behaviors are now up here beside the object's dimensions. So you can see here that this object is fixed and it has the ability to hug the contents. Now, inside, if we put this element inside another auto layout container, that's when we're going to get that other option, which tells us to allow the object to fill. And we'll show you that in the next example. So you'll notice that this frame is a fixed size, but when we click onto the elements inside this card, we have the ability to define all three options, whether this is going to be a fixed width, and we'll show a couple of examples where each of these can be really useful, and we can do this in both dimensions. So this is across the horizontal axis, and of course, we want to make a responsive card so that when this card gets wider, this text layer can stretch out horizontally. And then it's the same thing for this one here. You can see that we've set it to fill horizontally, but hug vertically. So when we press T on the keyboard and add some more text, I'm just going to copy this text and duplicate it, you'll see that the card maintains its fixed width, but because the card, if we go back here, is set to hug, the contents inside the frame are always going to define the height of that frame. So one question that always comes up with this example is, wait a second, I want this card to grow as I add more text, but I also want the card to be flexible width-wise. And it feels kind of odd, but the width property that you want to control in this isn't going to be made available to you until you put that inside another frame and set up either constraints or one of those fill container properties, which we'll show you in the next example. So just as a recap, each one of these horizontally is set to fill. And then each one of these objects that can expand, like the text and the parent card, is set to hug. So that way, when we expand this out, those layers are going to fill the auto layout frame. And if we add more text, it's going to grow vertically. Now, if we move over to the next example, you'll see that there's a little bit of a difference here. And one thing that you'll notice is that this card right now is fixed in both directions. And so in this particular case, we have our image set to fill and fill. We have our text object set to fill horizontally and hug vertically, meaning that, this text object can still get bigger if you add more text to it. But you'll notice that this last text box, and we're going to be going into a little bit of a deeper dive here, you'll see the text is truncating. So this is basically going to give you the ability to set up a card component or something like this with the ability to resize in all different directions, have the things respond, but also you can sort of like crop text that gets overflowed if there's not enough room for that text. So we'll talk a little bit more about text truncation, but you can kind of see the difference between these two. Now, if we come over to this example, and Miggy may jump in here at one point, you can see that each one of these cards is set to fill. And so this is where you kind of get into some interesting things where you can have an auto layout frame that is going to expand vertically. So just like before, if we come in and we add more text to one of these documents, you'll see that it expands this way. But we can also come in here, set all of these to hug. They'll hug the contents. And then if we go in and add more, each one of those cards will grow independently. Now, what's cool about this is that when we go in, we turn on our grids, you'll notice that this frame that we have the dotted line around, just so you can see the boundaries, is actually got some center constraints on it. But because this frame does not have auto layout applied to it, we can have an auto layout frame that's inside another frame that's not auto layout that can work with normal constraints. So if we set this to left and right, and I'll keep this on the center axis vertically, you'll see that when we resize this frame, that object is being aligned to the grids. And because each of these cards inside that frame are set to fill, you can still create that responsiveness. So in a lot of cases, what you might have is a standard viewport size, like maybe you're designing for an iPhone. You set up your iPhone size, you put in some of your cards inside an auto layout frame, and then you set that auto layout frame to have constraints. So that way, as your viewport gets wider, those objects can expand horizontally and they can still grow vertically, when there's more text. And then of course, if maybe this particular frame that you're working with had a background, like a red background or something, you can of course select this frame and set its height to hug contents so that that frame will always encapsulate all of the contents, no matter how large that they grow. And there's a whole bunch of useful shortcuts that Miggy's going to cover next. If you're used to that little diagram that the old version of auto layout used to have, there's actually an even faster way that Miggy's going to walk you through now.
All right, cool. Thanks, Tom. That was amazing. So I'm going to just cover some of the resizing shortcuts that we have here. This right here is an instance of an auto layout. So right now you'll see that as I'm scaling it, right, they're both set to fixed and fixed. So let's say instead I want this to be hug, and I don't want to go all the way over there, right? I want to spare myself some mouse miles of moving all the way over here and coming back. So if I just double click on that edge, and I could double click on this edge, now it's been set to hug and hug. So this will actually save you a ton of time. So if you accidentally move something, you're like, oh, I need this to be hug, I can double click it and then it'll like hug those values. So then you can adjust it that way. So the next thing that I have here is, let's say I have these elements and Tom was just talking about fill container. Let's say I want these elements to fill the container. So I can hold down the Option key or Alt key if you're on Windows and then just double click and they will now fill the container. So depending on which dimension you're choosing, that's what's going to then be set to fill. So if I select them over here, you'll see that that is fill and top and down hug, right? So also, once again, if I wanted to go back to hug, just double click it, double click it, double click it. And this whole container, if I want to set that to hug, I could double click it and then they're now all hug. So this should save you a ton of time. And it's basically just double clicking the vertical horizontal edge for hug contents and then Option or Alt double clicking to get those to be fill container. So it has to be inside of a container in order for it to fill it. All right, cool. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about alignment and some additional shortcuts here as well. So if you select any object, you see that this right here, this is set to fixed, and you can tell that it's fixed because it's showing the dimensions here on the canvas. Let's say I want to move these auto layout elements from within it. You can go over here, you can click on these the alignment widget that we call it over here. But with that selected, I can now implement a bunch of shortcuts. So what I can do is I can press up, left, down, right, right? So as I'm moving around this, let me unhover that padding, the spacing. So as I'm moving my arrow keys, right, this alignment widget is highlighted so I can see those changes. I can also use WASD and it'll go right to those edges as well. So let's say if I hit right, it's aligned to the sensor, and I press S, it'll go straight down. One thing that I do want to highlight here as well is that if you look over here into the layers panel, you'll actually see that the alignment is now reflected in the icon itself. So if this were left aligned, so if I go over here, if this were left aligned, you'll see that reflected in that icon to help you better visually understand where that is. And then we also, if you want to swap between space between and padding, with that alignment widget selected, you press the X key, right? And boom, I can press X and it'll toggle between space between, which is essentially just an auto value of spacing between that. You could always just type in A and you'll get auto. And if I press the X key on there again, it packs it together. So little shortcuts to help your process go as smoothly as possible. Next, let's talk about text baseline alignment. So in the same way that we were covering the alignment within, top right, bottom left, you can also align text. So here, and what that is basically the baseline of the text. If you have a bunch of different sizes, if you have text or different elements, and you want that first baseline to be aligned, you can turn that on. This is very similar to what you might see in Flexbox. So here inside of this auto layout, you'll see that I have a bunch of different elements. The easiest way to find this is in the advanced layout panel. You'll see the spacing mode. You'll see text baseline alignment down here. So you turn that on, you turn it off. However, the easiest way to turn it on and off is once again, select that alignment widget and press B for baseline. And you'll see that it then switches over. So if I press B again, it'll toggle that on and off. And for elements that don't have text in it, it's going to look for the bottom edge or for the first nested element that has a bottom edge. So it will try to do its best job to align to the icons the way that it might in CSS. Cool. So let's talk about canvas stacking. So basically before you only had one way to stack your canvas. So this is really helpful when you're using that negative padding and you want the first item to be on top or the last item to be on top. So what I can do here is hop into my canvas stacking and choose either first on top or last on top. First on top and last on top. And then that's going to save you any number of hacks that you used to have to perform to accomplish that task. Text truncation, we just started talking about this. So I have this example here as well. So any text field that you have, if you have some text, whenever you hold down the Option key or Alt key on Windows and you click on fixed size, what it's then going to do is it's going to make that text truncated text field. So here, I have a text field that is set to fill and fill on this auto layout object. So as there's more space or as there's less space, you'll see the little ellipses show up, and that's identified here as well. So as this expands and more space becomes available for the text, it'll show. But because inside of here, it is not only set with text truncation, which once again, Option click on that fixed field. Once I decrease the size, you'll see you'll get an ellipsis and it'll highlight and hide that text. Lastly, one thing that I want to talk about here is stroke values. So now stroke values, and let me demonstrate here with this visual. This is from the playground once again. Stroke values can now have a weight to them. So previously, whenever you have three objects and you have outside strokes, they wouldn't be counted as part of that space. So if you think about the box sizing property in CSS, however, now you can set a value where those strokes will be counted in the width and the padding will be counted in between them. So this is going to be strokes. What is it called again? It's called strokes have space, I think. So when it's ignored, you'll see that these objects are kind of out here, right, in this auto layout object with this inside stroke. But when it's applied, right, and all of these objects are set to fill, they now will have value, so they'll get pushed onto the inside. And I'm going to show you this example on one of the best ways that you can use it. So one other thing that we introduced with Figma recently with config was the ability to have independent stroke values. So right here, I think I have a component. So if you see over here on the right, I can choose stroke values on all sides. I can set it just to the top. I could set it to the bottom. I could set it to the left. I could set it to the right. I can even go in here and kind of customize how those values are applied. So what that means with auto layout is you can have a list. So if I set this value, right, the spacing here to 0, and I already had this turned on, so let me turn that off. So previously, if each of these items had an outside stroke, right, and they're in this auto layout, and that's set to 0, right, they're just stacked on top of each other. You're missing that additional stroke that you want at the bottom. So now what I can do is I can hop in here and say strokes are now included in layout. So that means they now have value in the determination of that height. So when I select this here, what I can do is I can actually increase that stroke, and that will also impact the auto layout as well. So that's one of those like really cool things that's kind of hidden in there, but it's going to save you from having to throw in individual line objects in your auto layout. It can now just be had right there on that slide. All right, Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you for absolute positioning. You're muted.
Classic move. Everyone has to do that once on the Zoom call. All right, let's talk a little bit about absolute positioning. Okay, so there's going to be many times where you've got an auto layout frame and you want something to not follow the stacking order of the auto layout frame. So this example here is like a classic example where you have an object that is a bunch of objects that are in an auto layout frame, and then you want to add this one item like a tooltip, and you don't want it to follow the layout. So we're going to show you how to do this. And when we do it, pay close attention to the layers panel, because you're going to see this little sort of like crop mark addition to the layer icon. And if you ever see that, or you come into somebody else's file and you see that, that's going to tell you that this item does not follow basically the stacking order of the auto layout. It can be positioned anywhere that you want. So if you look at this particular frame, we've got this icon, and it's an auto layout frame. And you'll see that we've got this icon that's positioned up here. So normally what happens is when we have something, even if we take it outside like this and we put it into the frame, it's just going to stack the item as the next item in the frame or in between two items. And so what you can do is when you click on this object, up here where the object's dimensions are listed, you're going to see this little icon that says absolute position. And if you click it, you'll notice that the containing frame resizes and the actual position of the item stays exactly where it was. And so then what you can do is like you can click and drag, or you can use your arrow keys to move it over and just get it into that right position. And what's cool is you can even have that object kind of like sit outside the frame, just like you would want inside for something to sort of like overlap. And what I find really helpful about this, not only is that I can now easily absolutely position this thing, I can also use constraints in tandem with it. So this will now use normal constraints. So in this case, I have this badge that's aligned to the top right. So I'm going to align it to the right and the top. And then that way, when you update the number, let's just say you're not at inbox 0 yet, and you change this to 1,000, that object is going to resize from that top right and sort of like expand in. And then if this icon or this object was to ever get bigger, that object is going to stay anchored to the right position. The other thing that's really handy about doing something like this, and this is sort of just like an underrated thing, is that sometimes when you have these things that like overlap something or overhang something, it's really nice that the actual boundaries of the frame kind of stick to the key object, because when you have like other objects on the canvas that you might want to align to, when I use Option W to align these to the top, you'll see that it's aligning to the thing that I most likely want to align to, which is the object itself rather than this overlapping badge. So absolute position is going to be huge for stuff like this. Now, if we look over here, you'll see that we can play with the placement of the absolute positioning items. And so we kind of covered this a little bit, but we could say, option S to align something to the bottom. This could be set to right and bottom. And then as these things expand and contract, you can make sure that the objects are going to stay anchored to the right corner that you want them to be visible on. Now, here's where things get a little bit more interesting. We're obviously talking about something simple like a badge. It's also going to allow you to create sort of like some interesting shapes that can be useful for creating like a fun button. So we have this button here, and if Raji's watching right now, his stress test is always creating some sort of like scalloped button. So what we've got here is a component. And if we go into outline mode, which was one of the things that we also shipped some improvements to, you'll see the construction of this object. And if you want to get into outline mode, you can just hit Shift O, and this will give you kind of like the skeleton X-ray of your design. One of the things that we changed in outline mode is the way that strokes are represented. So you can see the core object is this sort of like thick line that's part of the component, and then the dotted line represents the stroke. And then each one of these circles is subtracted out from this object. Now, this is just a standard component. There's no auto layout on it. And if we select each one of these things, you'll see that the constraints are set up to be left bottom, left top, right top, and so forth. And when we switch back in, you'll see that what we've created is a component which can be resized, keeping those sort of like nice corners. Now, where this comes into auto layout is we could now take something like a text object, like label. Let's just say we're making a button, and let's just beef the weight up of this a bit. And I'm going to hit Shift A to create a new auto layout frame. What will happen is I'm now going to drag this inside this frame, and you'll see that both of these things get pushed side by side. I'm now going to select this button shape that we clicked, and I'm going to set it to be absolutely positioned. And then you'll now see the frame resizes around the text object and has no impact on this. Now I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to select this and use my keyboard shortcuts with the square brackets here to change the stacking order of these. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some padding to this. So let's just add a little bit of padding, and we'll add a little bit of top and bottom padding. And then we'll select this object, and we're going to come down in here, and we're just going to, and again, this is where outline mode can be helpful as well. You can kind of like snap the shape to your auto layout frame. And we're going to come back in here and set the left and right constraints of this shape and the top and bottom constraints. So now you basically have an auto layout frame where the width is going to be defined by the text label, not the shape in the background. So now when we come in here and go click here, you can have this shape that's going to respond using those constraints so that you can create all sorts of like fun shapes that respond with your component. And that's also true in the vertical axis too, if you were to add more text. So we hope that's a really helpful tip. And we're going to show another cool example of this as we get through down into some more of the examples. Now, Miggy, I know you created this one. Do you want to speak to the tooltip example?
Yeah, let's do it. Cool. Sorry. Am I sharing? Can you see the thing?
We can see the thing.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. So this is just like another example of like what can be done with absolute positioning. So here, this is like a simple tooltip example. You've probably seen these tooltips throughout this file, just kind of highlighting some of those shortcuts. This was something that like I used to quickly make like some variants. And I'll show you how to kind of generate this pretty quickly. So basically type in some text. Whoops, sorry, I keep grabbing the wrong thing. I'm gonna press Shift A, and let's drop in some padding there. I'm gonna go ahead, apply that fill. Let's make that text be white. And let's round out those corners. So at this point, we have this text that'll kind of like grow and fill to that space. And what I'm gonna do is just go ahead and draw in, the polygon tool. And here I'm going to use this polygon tool. I'm emphasizing this because I know a lot of y'all forget about the polygon tool. It's one of my favorites. So I'm going to press Command E, and that's actually just going to wrap this around itself perfectly. So here we go. I can bring this down in size. So let's just go ahead and match that color. So what I can do with this is I'm going to drag it into that auto layout. Let's talk about that highlight mode or the outline mode one more time, Shift O. So there it is. I can hit the absolute positioning and I can go ahead and absolutely position it exactly where I want. And one thing that I want to highlight here too, if you hold down the space bar while dragging things in the absolute position, it will stay in scope. So I'm holding down the space bar and my absolute position item isn't going to snap outside of the frame. So there we go. So now I have this set up. Now, when I have this object here, I want to just reemphasize those constraints. So I'm going to set this to be center and I'm going to set this to be bottom. So then as I type this in, that's going to constantly, that's going to continue to follow suit. And if I wanted to go ahead and make that into a component, I can also make this into an actual component set and make additional ones. So let me just give myself a little bit more room here. And let's say if here I just wanted to say, the position. And I can go in and I can make this one be the bottom one. So this will be bottom. And I can go ahead and once again, same thing. As I'm dragging this, I'm holding down the spacebar key. I'm going to flip it with Shift V and I'm going to move this up. And there we go. Like I have like another version, and even in here, I can go in and control my constraints as well. So I could say that this is center and top. So then if I have an instance of this, there we go, and it'll grow from that main point. Let me just make sure I get that constraint right though. So here we go. This should be center and top. And there we go. So those constraints are really important. I know they're often overlooked, but having a good mastery of them will give you much more control. And then I'm just going to do this example really quick. This is an example that Tom put me onto, and I just thought it was like absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. So here I have this like little badge. I'm going to drop it right into my auto layout. I'm going to set this to absolute. I'm going to set it to top and right, and let's just move it out just like a little bit more. And what's cool about it is just making sure you set that constraint to right and top. So as you type, it'll follow that button. So just little bits like that are going to make your workflow that much easier. And Tom, I'm going to hand it off to you for the additional examples.
All right, so we've got a bunch of examples which are going to kind of recap some of the things. And what we're also going to try to do is just, it's not necessarily going to be teaching you anything new, but it hopefully will sort of like help kind of clue you into some really practical use cases where these things are going to come in handy. And we'll also tie in a couple of the other new features that, that we launched at Config. So you can see kind of a number of different ways to construct something. So I'm sure lots of you have created something before, like a label, and often you are building a component and you want it to have like some sort of focus state. And so sometimes it can be kind of tricky to sort of like have an outline for a form label and then also a focus ring, which may not be like directly attached to that. You kind of might want it to be sitting outside. So again, using absolute positioning, I can drag this item into my form label, which obviously does not look like I want it to look, but I can now take this object and make it positioned absolute. Whoops, what did I do there? Hold on a second. There we go. And then I'm going to use my alignment shortcuts to Option D and Option W. And then I'm going to use my keyboard to just kind of nudge that into the right place. Then I can take my constraints to say left and right and top and bottom. So now if I go in here and I resize this form field, whoops, I didn't set that one to be the right thing. Just set that to fill the container. I now have this object that's going to follow this particular frame as the focus state expands. Now, I want to show you an addition to this. If we come over here to this example, this is where you start getting into some things with variants, and we also introduced a feature called component properties. Now, we're not going to do a deep dive on component properties today, but I wanted to show you this thing to just get your mind thinking about how all of these features can work together. I've got this focus ring that is available on all three of my variants. Now, this particular variant is my label with my placeholder text. And then I have my label with my text entered into the input field. And then I have this inactive value. Now, one of the things that you sometimes run into is you want to be able to toggle these things off, but I don't want to have to build out an option for each of these that has the focus state and doesn't have the focus state. So what component properties allows you to do is click something like a layer, like this rectangle that we've turned into our focus state. And in our initial variant, we just have that one layer selected. You'll see that there's this little object here that allows you to select all of the matching layers across all of the variants. And then what we can do is we could apply a layer visibility Boolean property to this focus state. So you can see I'm doing it in all three places here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to create a property, and it's going to be called focus, and the default value is going to be true. Now each one of these things is linked into a visibility toggle. So if I bring out, oops, I meant to bring out the whole variant, my bad. If I bring out this entire variant, you'll now see that we have a focus state that toggles our absolutely positioned layer in the auto layout frame. Now, you'll notice one thing that happens that is probably not a state that exists in your design system, which is a focused version of an inactive field. So you can see here, we now have our inactive field and the focus ring is true, which is not something that exists. So one of the cool things that you can do here is you can come in, select that absolutely positioned layer, and you can actually detach it from that component property. So now if I detach it and I hide our focus ring, when we go and switch to our active state, we can get the focus ring and we get the control to toggle its visibility. But if we move to the inactive state, we remove the option of making it focus. So this is where you can use like an absolutely positioned element tied to a Boolean visibility prop that's made conditional based on how it's used in a particular variant. So we hope that helps in sort of a real world example. Now here's another one. And this is like, I don't know, for whatever reason, this is like one of my favorite components to build because there's so many different ways to build it. And we're gonna build both of these from scratch so you can get a sense of like how you could use individual strokes to create something like this, and how you could also use absolutely position to create something like this, depending on the effect that you're going for. So here I have a tab label. It's just a text layer. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add some auto layout a frame around it. And then what I can do is just hold Option, drag these handles. I'm going to make the tab just a little bit bigger. And then what I can do is hit Shift A again to put this inside another frame. So if we come over here into our layers panel, let's rename some layers. We have a tab, and then we have our tab container. Now, just like Miggy showed earlier, this tab container, I actually don't want it to have any padding on it. So if I hold Command, click into this input field, I can just update all of the padding values on all four sides, just like that, and press Enter. And now we have no padding. I can go in and select my tab option, and I'm going to hit Command D to duplicate a bunch of my tabs. Now, right now they're in a vertical arrangement, so I can come over here and set them to be horizontal. And then what we can do is we can use our stroke settings to add a stroke. We're going to turn it on just on the bottom. I'll make it a light gray color. Let's remove one of these so that it's not going off the screen. And then we'll select our selected tab. We'll add a stroke. We'll make it also just on the bottom. We'll make it a little thicker, and then we'll give it a color. So now you have tabs that are going to be expandable. If we type in a new text object, if I type in the word music, those tabs are all going to shift. And my little indicator is going to resize automatically. Now, one thing with strokes that's really nice is that you're not adding any additional elements into the auto layout stack. However, there are situations where you actually don't want to do this. Sometimes you might want to animate this little indicator. And I've got another example that's built out here, which is basically the same construction, but instead of using the individual strokes, you'll see inside the tab bar here, I have my indicator, which is set to be an absolutely positioned layer, and I've manually resized it to be the width of my initial tab. Now, where this can be helpful is that when you have a bunch of different screens, we could move the placement of it, we could resize that rectangle, and then what we can do is when we go into prototyping mode, whether we're making an interactive component or such, we can go in here and you can see that all of these things are linked together. So now if we go in here to see like a little preview of what this works, you now have this absolutely positioned layer, which is working with Smart Animate. And we're also using Spring animations to just create like a fun tab navigation sort of thing. So two different ways to achieve kind of the same different thing, depending on whether or not you're gonna have an animation and sort of the interactive version of that. But I hope that helps. Okay, the next example is kind of similar to the earlier example that we were showing, but again, this is kind of a little bit more of a situation where you want to have a text object that is going to control the height of the card itself, but you want all of the cards to have the same height, and you want to have all of your call to actions aligned. And you'll see what I mean when we go in and add more text here. When I add more text, you can see that all of these are expanding vertically, and our call to action is always anchored to the bottom. So to break this down, this little notification here is set to be absolutely positioned in the top. And then this one here is set to be left bottom. And you'll notice that we've compensated for the height of this button in the padding. So you can see here, here's our padding control. This keeps the text from running into the button. And then all of these cards are set to fill and fill in both directions. And this entire frame is set to hug. So now you have a frame that's going to expand to the height of the tallest card, and then all of your cards are going to stay the same height, and you can have that nice sort of like alignment where all the images are aligned, all of the text is aligned, and then all of those call to action buttons are aligned. So I know that this is a common pattern that people have tried to solve for, and absolutely positioning makes that much, much easier to solve for. Okay, the next one, if you remember this example here, is kind of like a one of my favorite things, but it kind of factors in the absolute positioning and the negative spacing. So we've used this little flow component that we've created, and we've set up the constraints to all of the objects using Boolean operations. And then we've put an instance of that inside each one of these containers. And so what's nice is that if we have a larger menu item like hello world, this custom shape is going to resize. And if we take all of these and put them inside an auto layout container by Shift A, you can now use the negative margin spacing to just create an overlapped version, which gives you this nice little stepper. And if you want to add additional options, you can just hit Command D. We now have step 4. And if you're using this pattern sort of like in a shopping cart checkout flow, and you want to have these like interlocking shapes, using all of these things together is a great way to do that. Now with that, I think we'll head over to answer any remaining questions. I think that's the plan, right, Miggy?
Yeah, let's go.
All right.
All right, here I'll share my screen. Okay. So we have some questions here. I saw that somebody asked, is there a shortcut to make a component a non-component frame again? Absolutely. So it depends if you're talking about an instance or not. So if I take this object, I'm gonna need my UI, hold on. Boop, there we go. If I have this object and it is a component and I have an instance of it, you'll see that right now it is that. So Command Shift G or Control Shift G will then break it. No, I'm sorry, that's not it. It's a detach instance. Sorry. Yeah. So detach instance, I can't do. I always forget that shortcut. Tom, you know what it is for detach instance?
Command
It's
Option B.
Command Option B.
Detach all the time.
Option, yeah, Command Option B. So there we go. That'll detach the instance back, but you won't be able to do that on a main component. And then if you ever have like a frame and you want to break out of the frame, it's going to be Command Shift G, and then it'll break out of the frame back into the objects that you have. All right. Is there any other questions?
There's a question that I can address while you're finding the next one that came in through the Q&A, which was like components filled with hidden layers perform better. In the past, we found that in big files, they would really pull down their performance. This is a question that we've heard a lot since shipping the Boolean properties with component properties. The idea here is that when you have a big variant set that has hidden layers in it, Figma loads all of the variants into memory so that you have easy access to all the different variations of a component. But with component properties, you can build components that have less variance. And so there's kind of like a trade-off there. So I don't think you'll hit any performance issues as a result of that. But if you do, definitely let us know. Thanks for the question, Caddy.
One thing I saw, someone says, what's the best place to learn about component variants? I know that with component properties, we have a playground right here. So if you want to learn about component properties, I would just say that check out figma.com, or sorry, youtube.com/Figma design for additional videos. But there's a community playground, and there's going to be an upcoming live stream, Tom, on component properties and, and variants.
If you go to figma.com/events, there's 2 office hours that are coming up. One is on variable fonts, and the other one is on component properties, and you'll be able to register there. The variable fonts is on May 24th, and the component properties one is on May 26th.
And then here I'm going to share the component properties events there as well.
Cool.
Cool. So is there a way to retain the image aspect ratio within the card as it resizes? Currently, that we don't have that currently. Um, what we do usually recommend for that is like having like a couple of kind of like target sizes. But right now, it's basically going to be the options that we have. I know that this is something that we're looking into. Um, this with truncation, does it tell you the max values per line? I don't think it's something necessarily. Right now, we just try to do the best thing possible in kind of truncating it in the same way that you would see it, I think, with like CSS. Is that right, Tom? So it's like providing enough space for like the ellipses to show up. But I don't think right now it's going to be based off of just
Yeah.
like the font size and like what you do. So like
And the
as you
size of the
scale it
text
down,
box.
yeah, it's just going to try to fit it within that space, provide the ellipsis character to demonstrate it in that way. So it's going to be more visual than computational. I always wondered why auto layout defaulted to fixed width. So with this question, the one thing that I would say here is that with auto layout, something needs to generate width. Something needs to generate value. So in the absence of something that is generating value, you might run into some issues. So that's why it might change something to fixed width. So if we take a look at the examples up here, right? So here we say that the container is responding to content size. So the internal contents are what's driving the size. So you need something that is going to compute that value. When we look at here and you see the content responds to container size, here that container is the fixed value. So fixed value needs to be assigned to something. So even here, you'll see that as this is basically growing, right? Like that is the hug is hugging those contents, and then those values are being computed. So just like with CSS, something needs to take that value. So if you see things automatically being set to fixed, it's because it needs something to latch onto to generate that size. Hopefully those keyboard shortcuts really do help you out a lot. I know they help me a lot in just kind of quickly adjusting things around, because with auto layout, like I said, it's going to try to do what it needs to do to generate like that width or that height when you're creating things. So that's why it might automatically set something as being packed versus like space between, or relying on something to be fixed as opposed to just being set to fill.
There was
All
a
right.
another question here that I was going to answer from Carrie, which is some situations seem like you can use absolute positioning for auto layout. Is there a good rule of thumb to pick of when to pick which? One of the things I've found with absolute positioning is that if the arrangement that you're trying to make is going to require you to create like another frame to nest the thing in, then I find usually I default to using the absolute positioning feature, because generally speaking, the more layers of frame nesting that you have, it's like the more clicks that you have to get into this thing. It just makes the whole thing seem a little bit more complex. That's why before a lot of people were using like the zero height frame trick as an element in the auto layout, and like sometimes it made things hard to select. So I would recommend in most cases, if like you need to add an additional frame to do it, you probably want to just use the absolute positioning feature in most cases.
Cool. I have one other thing to add to that too. When you're applying absolute positioning, like think about scope in the same way that you might with like CSS. So like if I had this element, just in the let's say if I remove its auto layout, and sorry, I know that this could be confusing. Let me just remove some of these. So if this is in the normal stack order with everything, right, and I apply this as absolute and I move this here, right, it's going to be much more difficult to know its current position. However, if this is instead, so let's say I bring this out, if these two are auto layouted together, and this one then has the absolute positioning, right? It is now, like scoped, in this space. So then it can be brought into here. So if you think about it, you can absolutely position to that parent, or you can create kind of like another nested one. So I know Tom was saying like don't go too nested in, but if it makes sense, you're going to be much better off for it. So like here, if I increase like the messages icon size, right, the constraint of this being set to the right and to the top is going to be maintained. And the cool thing about that is if I go into the inspect panel, you'll actually see position absolutes. Sorry for the janky values. I scaled everything up and down, but you'll see that it's basically doing its best to apply it from the right and from the top. If you change those constraints of its position, so like right now, if I hop in here, whatever those constraints are going to be, it's going to adjust itself accordingly in working within the scope of that object, if that makes sense. Cool. I think we're all about done. A couple things that we do want to highlight. Make sure that you check out future live streams at figma.com/events. Our next couple of live streams are going to be focused on variable fonts as well as component props. So make sure you check that out. Component properties is something that like I definitely still need demystified for myself. If you have any suggestions and ideas for future live streams, check out community@figma.com. Also, we just want to throw in really quick, there is a keyboard shortcut pane that we just added to the Figma playground file. So if you're saying like, man, those are a lot of shortcuts, they're really helpful, I'd really like to check them out, go check that out, figma.com/community, and look for the auto layout playground file. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Tom, for hopping on this live stream. This was rad. Thanks for all the amazing questions. You all are absolutely amazing.
Yeah, this has been so much fun. One thing that I saw, there was a couple of questions for some of the examples that we were showing at the end. People were like, "Oh, these examples are really helpful, but they're not in the playground file." And so I had responded to somebody. We'll try to add some additional examples to that playground file and publish an update before end of day. So if you want to check back to that playground file again tomorrow to get even more examples, we'll make sure a few of those ones that we were showing are part of that now. So hopefully that is helpful. Also, I know it's hard to answer all the questions. There's still a few in the open Q&A. So if we didn't get to your question, please follow us on Twitter or reach out. I always share my email too. You can just email me at tom@figma.com and we'll try to get your questions answered. If you hit a roadblock with auto layout, thank you so much for joining today. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, thank you.